She walked out when he was dying. Now she wants half his money. I'm Henry Coleman, and that was my son James they abandoned. For 15 years, I watched cancer try to kill my boy while his wife planned her escape. I sold everything, my house, my truck, my retirement, to keep him alive. She filed divorce papers while he was getting chemotherapy. But James was smarter than both of us realized. He recorded everything. And when she showed up with her lawyer demanding $24 million, I finally understood why my dying son had smiled and said, "Dad, trust me on this one." I looked at her designer clothes and her expensive attorney, and I did something that surprised everyone in that room. I said yes. If you're watching this, please subscribe and let me know where you are watching from. This is a story about what real family means. But first, let me tell you what she did to my son. January 22nd, 2024. That's the day Victoria Hartwell walked back into my life. I was sitting in the law office of Morrison & Associates, still wearing my work clothes from that morning. Carhartt jacket with Coleman plumbing stitched on the pocket. Boots that had seen 40 years of crawl spaces and pipe repairs. I'd driven my 1998 Ford pickup with 290,000 miles to hear James's will reading. The lawyer, a young woman named Jennifer Morrison, had just finished explaining that James left everything to me, $24 million. His company, Innovate Dynamics, his house, his cars, everything. "There must be some mistake," I said. "I'm just a retired plumber." That's when the doors opened. Victoria walked in first. White BMW X7 parked outside. Custom license plate reading VH Heart 1. Designer heels clicking on marble floors. Behind her, a man in a $3,000 suit carrying a briefcase that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. "Victoria Hartwell," she announced, like I might have forgotten. "James's wife." "Ex-wife," I corrected. "You divorced him 15 years ago." The man stepped forward. "Andrew Blackstone, attorney for Mrs. Hartwell. We're here to contest this will." Jennifer Morrison shuffled her papers nervously. "I wasn't expecting any challenges to the estate." Blackstone placed his briefcase on the table with theatrical precision. "My client has substantial grounds for contesting this distribution. She was married to the deceased for 7 years. Colorado is a community property state." "They were divorced," I repeated. Victoria finally spoke, her voice carrying that same condescending tone I remembered. "Henry, you always were simple-minded about legal matters. Marriage creates certain permanent obligations." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Not fear, something else. "What kind of obligations?" Blackstone opened his briefcase. "Mrs. Hartwell maintained contact with James throughout their separation. She provided emotional support during his illness. She has documentation proving their ongoing relationship." He slid a folder across the table. Phone records, email printouts, what looked like receipts. "This proves continuous communication and financial interdependence," Blackstone continued. "Under Colorado Statute 42-7-101, a spouse may claim inheritance rights if the marriage was never properly dissolved emotionally or financially." Jennifer Morrison looked confused. "But the divorce was final in 2009. "Divorce papers are just paperwork," Victoria said, examining her manicured nails. "What matters is the reality of a relationship. James needed me. He reached out constantly." I stared at the documents. James's phone number, calls lasting hours, emails with subject lines like "missing you" and "need to talk." "This can't be right," I whispered. Victoria leaned forward, her perfume expensive and sharp. "Henry, you did your best, but you're a plumber. James was a tech billionaire. He needed someone who understood his world." "You left him," I said. "I gave him space to grow," she corrected. "And he appreciated it. That's why he called me the night before he died." The room went quiet. Blackstone cleared his throat. "We're prepared to settle for 50% of the estate, $12 million. It's more than generous, considering Mrs. Hartwell could claim the entire amount." Jennifer Morrison was frantically typing on her laptop. "I need time to review these documents. This is highly irregular." "Take all the time you need," Victoria said, standing. "But Henry, understand something. I have rights here, legal rights, and unlike you, I can afford to fight for them." She walked toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and Henry? That little house you bought after selling yours for James's medical bills? 1,200 square feet, assessed at $89,000? That's sweet. Really. But this is about real money now. The door closed behind them with a soft click. I sat there, staring at the documents, wondering how I was supposed to fight people who could afford lawyers like Andrew Blackstone. But James had said to trust him. What did my son know that I didn't? The next 3 days were the longest of my life. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, kept walking through James's house, my house now apparently, touching things that still smelled like him, his coffee mug in the sink, his reading glasses on the kitchen table, his 2019 Tesla Model S in the driveway that I was afraid to move. The will reading had been on a Monday. By Thursday, the Denver Post was running a story. Local plumber inherits tech fortune, ex-wife challenges will. My phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters, lawyers offering their services, people I hadn't heard from in decades suddenly concerned about my well-being. I unplugged it. But I couldn't unplug the math running through my head. $24 million. James's life work. His company that employed 137 people. His patents that were revolutionizing data security. His dream of starting a foundation to help families facing medical bankruptcy. All of it hanging on documents I didn't understand, claimed by a woman who'd walked out when my son needed her most. I pulled out my checkbook and looked at the numbers I knew by heart. Social Security, $2,100 monthly. Savings account, $3,412.16. The exact amount left after 15 years of paying down James's medical debt, $180,000. That's what it cost to keep my son alive for 4 years after Victoria left. Oncology treatments itemized down to the last IV bag. Experimental therapies insurance wouldn't cover. Clinical trials in Houston and Boston that required travel and hotel stays. I'd sold my house for $89,000. Sold my truck. Cashed out my retirement. Took a second mortgage on the little place I bought afterward. All of it went to keeping James alive. And Victoria. The Denver Post had pulled her social media from that time. Pictures from Cabo, Paris, a cooking class in Tuscany. While James was getting chemotherapy, she was posting photos of herself at wine tastings. Living my best life, one caption read. Posted the same day James spent 16 hours in the emergency room with complications from his treatment. If I lost this fight, everything James built would go to her. Innovate Dynamics would be sold to the highest bidder. Those 137 employees would lose their jobs. The foundation James dreamed about would never exist. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was sitting in my kitchen Thursday night, reading Victoria's interview in the Post online. Henry is a good man, she'd told the reporter. He did what he could. But James was a complex person with complex needs. He needed intellectual stimulation, emotional sophistication, someone who could match his ambition. The article continued. Mrs. Hartwell, who maintains a successful wellness and lifestyle blog with over 200,000 followers, says she never stopped loving her ex-husband. I knew he was sick, she explains, but I also knew that if I stayed, I'd become a nurse instead of a partner. James needed space to fight his battle, and he needed to know I believed he'd win. She'd turned abandonment into sacrifice, made herself the hero of a story where she'd played the villain. The reporter ate it up. A love story complicated by illness and misunderstanding, now playing out in probate court. My hands were shaking when I finished reading. This wasn't just about money. Victoria wasn't just trying to steal James's fortune. She was trying to steal his story, rewrite history so that leaving him became an act of love instead of cowardice. I thought about calling Jennifer Morrison, but what could I say? That Victoria was lying? Based on what? My word against phone records and emails that seemed to prove ongoing contact? I thought about hiring my own lawyer, but the retainer fee for anyone qualified to fight Andrew Blackstone would probably cost more than my house was worth. I thought about just walking away, taking nothing, letting Victoria have it all. But then I remembered James's last words to me, 3 days before he died, when the morphine was making him drift in and out of consciousness. "Dad," he'd whispered, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "If Victoria comes back, play recording number 238. Recording number 238. His phone was in my kitchen drawer, still charged, still protected by his fingerprint. But he'd given me the passcode months ago, when the treatments made his hands shake too much to type. I'd never looked at those recordings. They felt too private, too painful. But James had been specific. Recording 238. What had my son recorded? And why had he been so certain Victoria would come back? I pulled out his phone and scrolled to the voice memos. 237 recordings. The last one dated 3 days before he died. I pressed play on number 238. My son's weak but determined voice filled the kitchen. "Dad, if you're hearing this, it means the vultures have landed." James's voice from the recording was weak but clear. "Dad, if you're hearing this, it means the vultures have landed. Victoria's back, isn't she? With her lawyer and her sob story about loving me?" I sat in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, listening to my dead son. "She thinks you're just a simple plumber who doesn't understand the game. She's wrong. You understand loyalty. She never did." The recording continued for 11 minutes. Instructions, evidence, a plan. When it ended, I finally understood why James had smiled. Friday morning, Victoria requested a meeting. To discuss terms, Blackstone had told Jennifer Morrison. Perhaps we can reach an amicable settlement. We met at Morrison's office again. Same marble floors, same expensive briefcase, same condescending smile from Victoria. But I wasn't the same man who'd sat there Monday. "Henry," Victoria began, settling into her chair like she owned it, "I've been thinking about our situation. Have you? This doesn't have to be adversarial. James loved both of us in different ways." Blackstone opened his folder. "We're prepared to reduce our claim to 40%, 9.6 million. That leaves you with over 14 million, Henry. More money than you could spend in 10 lifetimes." I looked at them both. 9.6 million. "It's more than fair," Victoria said, "considering I could claim everything." "Based on what?" She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. "Based on this." She played a voicemail. James's voice, tired and slurred from medication. "Victoria, I know I said some harsh things during the divorce. I was hurt, scared, but I never stopped loving you. Call me when you get this." "That's from 2 years ago," Victoria said. "One of dozens. He called me constantly." "When was this exactly?" Blackstone consulted his notes. "March 15th, 2022. I nodded slowly. "March 15th. What else happened that day?" Victoria frowned. "I don't understand." James kept detailed calendars, medical appointments, treatment schedules. March 15th, 2022 was the day he found out his cancer had metastasized. Stage 4. What does that have to do with anything? He was scared, desperate, reaching out to anyone who might care. "Exactly my point," Victoria said triumphantly. "He needed me." "Where were you when he called?" "I don't see how that's relevant." I pulled out my own phone and scrolled to a screenshot I'd taken that morning. "Your Instagram post from March 15th. Amazing sunset cruise in the Caribbean. #blessed, living my best life. Posted 4 hours after he left that voicemail." Victoria's smile wavered. "I was traveling, for work." "A sunset cruise was work? I'm an influencer, Henry. Travel content is part of my brand." "So while my son was getting a death sentence, you were drinking champagne on a yacht?" Blackstone intervened. "Mrs. Hartwell's location doesn't diminish the emotional significance of their communication." "Doesn't it?" Victoria leaned forward. "Henry, you're making this more complicated than it needs to be. James was sick. He wasn't thinking clearly. You did what you could, but you're not equipped to handle an estate this size." "Equipped how?" "You live in a 1,200-square-foot house. You drive a truck with almost 300,000 miles. You've never managed anything bigger than a plumbing business." "And you have?" "I understand wealth, Henry. I understand the responsibilities that come with it. James built something important. It needs proper stewardship." "Like you stewarded your marriage?" Her mask slipped for just a moment. "That's not fair." "Fair." I set my phone on the table. "Let me tell you about fair, Victoria. Fair is staying when someone needs you. Fair is selling everything you own to pay for treatment. Fair is sleeping in hospital chairs for weeks. I couldn't handle watching him suffer. So you made him suffer alone." "That's not what happened." "Then what did happen? Explain it to me like I'm just a simple plumber." Victoria glanced at Blackstone, who nodded encouragingly. "James and I had different coping mechanisms," she said carefully. "He needed to focus on treatment. I needed space to process my emotions. We agreed that separation would be healthier for both of us." "You agreed to abandon him?" "We agreed to maintain emotional distance while preserving our bond. Is that what you call those Instagram posts from Cabo? I was grieving the life we'd planned together, on a beach, with cocktails. Everyone grieves differently, Henry." I picked up my phone again. "James grieved differently too. Would you like to know how? Victoria's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? He kept records, very detailed records of everything. Blackstone shifted in his chair. What kind of records? Phone calls, medical appointments, conversations, financial transactions. I don't see how that's relevant to our claim, Blackstone said. Maybe not, I agreed. But it's very relevant to understanding what really happened during those 7 years of marriage. Victoria's voice went cold. What are you implying? I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. James documented everything because he was a careful man, a man who valued truth. And what truth did he document? I smiled for the first time since Monday. That's what we're going to find out. Victoria stood abruptly. This is ridiculous. Andrew, we don't have to sit here and listen to accusations from a bitter old man. Bitter? I looked up at her. No, Victoria, I'm not bitter. I'm curious. About what? About how you knew James was sick before he told anyone. The room went silent. Victoria sat back down. I never said that. Didn't you? Monday you said I knew he was sick. But James didn't tell anyone about his diagnosis for 6 weeks, not even me. Victoria's face had gone pale. I misspoke. Did you? Or did you know something the rest of us didn't? Blackstone was frantically writing notes. Victoria was staring at me like she'd never seen me before. James called me the night before he died, she said finally. That proves our connection. Does it? Or does it prove something else entirely? What are you talking about? I stood up, walked to the door, then turned back. I guess we'll find out, won't we? That afternoon, Andrew Blackstone filed an emergency motion to expedite the probate hearing. Time is of the essence, his filing read. The estate's assets are substantial and require immediate resolution to prevent deterioration of value. Translation: Victoria was scared. I drove home in my old pickup, thinking about the look on her face when I'd mentioned James's records. For the first time since this started, she'd looked genuinely worried. My phone rang as I pulled into my driveway. Unknown number. Mr. Coleman? This is Samuel Winters. I was James's attorney for Innovate Dynamics. I knew the name. James had mentioned him occasionally. Harvard Law, corporate specialist, the kind of lawyer who charged $800 an hour. I've been following the probate situation, Samuel continued. I wonder if we might meet. I can't afford a lawyer like you, Mr. Winters. This isn't about fees. James was my friend. We need to talk. An hour later, Samuel Winters sat in my living room looking completely out of place. Designer suit, Italian shoes, briefcase that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. But his eyes were kind, and when he talked about James, I heard genuine grief. He was brilliant, Samuel said. Not just technically, strategically. James thought 3 moves ahead in every situation. Victoria seems to think she outmaneuvered him. Samuel smiled. That's what James was counting on. What do you mean? James knew she'd come back. He's been preparing for this moment for 2 years. Samuel opened his briefcase and pulled out a sealed envelope. My name was written on it in James's handwriting. He gave me specific instructions. If Victoria ever challenged the will, I was to give you this immediately. I stared at the envelope. What's in it? I don't know. James sealed it in front of me but never told me the contents. He just said, when Victoria shows her true colors, Dad will need ammunition. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a list of numbers, phone recording dates and times, account numbers, file names, and at the bottom, an address I didn't recognize. What is this? I have no idea, but James left other things too. Samuel reached into his briefcase again and pulled out a key ring. 3 keys. One looked like a safe deposit box key. One was clearly for a storage unit. The third was unmarked. He rented a safe deposit box at First National 2 years ago. Paid for 10 years in advance. The storage unit is out on Highway 36, Unit 207. What's in them? James said you'd know what to do when the time came. My hands were shaking as I looked at the list again. Some of the recording numbers matched voice memos on James's phone. Others were different, longer sequences. Samuel, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you think Victoria really maintained contact with James? Samuel was quiet for a long moment. I handled James's legal affairs for 3 years. If he'd been in regular communication with his ex-wife, I would have known. especially if it involved any kind of emotional or financial reconciliation. But the phone records Blackstone showed us. Phone records can be misleading. They show calls were made. They don't show who initiated them or what was said. I thought about the voicemail Victoria had played, James's desperate voice reaching out for comfort. "There's something else," Samuel said. "James updated his will 6 times in the last 2 years. Every version left everything to you, but in the most recent version, dated just 1 week before he died, he added a specific clause." "What kind of clause?" "If anyone challenges this will based on claims of ongoing relationship with the deceased, all evidence relevant to said relationship shall be made public as part of the court record." "What does that mean?" Samuel smiled grimly. "It means if Victoria wants to claim she had a relationship with James, she's opening the door to scrutiny of exactly what that relationship entailed." I looked down at the list in my hands. Recording numbers, account numbers, file locations. James documented everything, didn't he? Everything. Your son was extremely thorough. Why didn't he just expose her before he died? Because he wanted her to expose herself. James understood that the truth has more power when people discover it for themselves. Samuel stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Mr. Coleman, there's one more thing. James made me promise to tell you this if Victoria ever came back." "What?" "He said to remember what you taught him about fixing pipes. Sometimes the problem isn't where the water's coming out. Sometimes you have to follow the leak back to find where it really started." After Samuel left, I sat alone with James's keys, his list, and his plan I was only beginning to understand. Outside, a car drove slowly past my house. White BMW with license plate VHart1. Victoria was watching me, but I was done being watched. It was time to start following the leak back to its source. Monday morning, February 5th. The probate hearing was set for 9 a.m. at the Jefferson County Courthouse. I put on my best clothes, khakis, button-down shirt, and the sport coat I'd worn to James's funeral. In my truck, I had the keys Samuel had given me and the list from James's envelope. I'd visited the safe deposit box and storage unit over the weekend. What I'd found changed everything. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters. Victoria had apparently called a press conference for 8:30, just before the hearing. I parked across the street and watched from my truck. She stood on the courthouse steps like she was running for office, hair perfect, makeup professional, a navy dress that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 6 months. "This isn't about money," Victoria told the cameras. "This is about honoring James's true wishes. He was a brilliant man whose final decisions were clouded by pain medication and family pressure." A reporter shouted a question. "What evidence do you have of continued relationship with the deceased?" "James called me regularly. We maintained emotional intimacy throughout our separation. His father, while well-meaning, simply doesn't understand the complexities of our bond." Another reporter. "Why contest the will now? Why not during the reading?" Victoria's smile was practiced, sympathetic. "I didn't want to cause Henry additional pain during his grief, but James's estate includes a major technology company with significant social responsibility. 137 families depend on Innovate Dynamics for their livelihoods. This isn't about what's best for Henry Coleman. It's about what's best for everyone James cared about." She was good. I had to give her that, making herself the protector of James's employees while painting me as a selfish old man clinging to money I didn't deserve. "Henry Coleman is a good man," Victoria continued. "He did his best during a difficult time. But managing a $24 million estate requires sophisticated understanding of business, law, and fiduciary responsibility. I have an MBA from Northwestern and 8 years of experience in corporate consulting." A lie. I'd checked. Victoria had a bachelor's degree in communications and had never worked in corporate consulting, but the reporters were eating it up. "What's your relationship with Mr. Coleman now?" "I feel nothing but compassion for Henry. He sacrificed tremendously for James, but sacrifice doesn't qualify someone to manage complex assets. James knew that. That's why he reached out to me in his final weeks." I got out of my truck and started walking toward the courthouse. The crowd of reporters noticed me immediately. "Mr. Coleman! Mr. Coleman! Any comment on Mrs. Hartwell's allegations?" Victoria turned when she heard my name. Our eyes met across the courthouse steps. She was still smiling, but something flickered in her expression when she saw me walking calmly through the crowd. "Henry," she called out, like we were old friends. "I was just explaining the situation to these nice people. I climbed the steps slowly. The reporters parted around me, cameras following my every move. "Mrs. Hartwell," I said when I reached the top. "That's quite a speech." "I was just sharing the truth." "Were you?" The cameras were rolling. Victoria's smile never wavered, but I could see the calculation behind her eyes. "Henry, I know this is difficult for you. Change always is. But James wanted what's best for everyone he cared about." "Including his employees?" "Especially his employees. James built something important. It deserves proper stewardship." I nodded thoughtfully. "You mentioned your MBA from Northwestern." "That's right. And your corporate consulting experience. 8 years in Chicago." "Interesting. What firm?" Victoria's pause lasted maybe 2 seconds. But on camera, with a dozen microphones picking up every word, 2 seconds is an eternity. "Several firms," she said finally. "I was an independent consultant." "Independent, that's convenient." "What's that supposed to mean?" A reporter called out. "Mr. Coleman, do you dispute Mrs. Hartwell's qualifications?" I turned to the camera. "I don't dispute anything. I just think people should know the truth before they make judgments." "And what truth is that?" Victoria asked. The edge in her voice was barely perceptible, but I caught it. The truth about what really happened during James's illness. The truth about who was there and who wasn't. The truth about what James actually wanted. "James wanted me to be part of his life," Victoria said firmly. "That's why he called me before he died." "Is that what he wanted? Or is that what you wanted people to believe?" Victoria's smile was starting to look strained. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. James was very specific about his wishes, very detailed in his documentation." "What documentation?" Behind Victoria, I saw Andrew Blackstone pushing through the crowd, looking panicked. He'd obviously seen the exchange and was trying to reach his client before she said something she'd regret. But it was too late. "You said James called you the night before he died," I continued. "What did you talk about?" "That's private." "Is it? Because if you're claiming it as evidence of ongoing relationship, it becomes public record." Victoria glanced around, suddenly aware that she was surrounded by cameras and microphones, all recording her every word. "Henry, this isn't the time or place." "When is the time and place? When you're alone with expensive lawyers making claims about relationships that never existed?" "They did exist." "Did they? Then you won't mind if we examine the evidence." "What evidence?" I smiled for the cameras. "The evidence James left behind. All of it." Behind the crowd, I saw Samuel Winters climbing the courthouse steps. He was carrying a briefcase and looking like a man who knew exactly what was about to happen. Victoria saw him too. Her face went pale. "Samuel," she said nervously, "I didn't know you'd be here." "Mrs. Hartwell." Samuel's voice was professionally neutral. "I represent the estate's interests." "Of course. That's good. We should all want what's best for James's legacy." "Absolutely," Samuel agreed. "That's why I brought some additional documentation for today's hearing." "What kind of documentation?" Samuel opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. Communications records, financial transactions, medical files, everything James preserved. Victoria's composure finally cracked. "Those are private." "Not anymore," Samuel said quietly. "Not when they're relevant to determining James's true wishes." The reporters were frantically scribbling notes. Cameras were recording every word. And Victoria Hartwell, for the first time since this whole thing started, looked like a woman who had just realized she'd walked into a trap. "I think we should continue this conversation inside," Andrew Blackstone said, finally reaching his client. "Excellent idea," Samuel agreed. "The courtroom is much more appropriate for what I have to share." As we all moved toward the courthouse doors, I heard Victoria whisper something to Blackstone. I couldn't make out the words, but I recognized the tone. Panic. James had been right. Sometimes you have to let people expose themselves. And Victoria Hartwell had just done exactly that, in front of a dozen cameras and twice as many reporters. The truth was about to come out. All of it. Judge Patricia Reynolds had been on the bench for 22 years. She'd seen every kind of family dispute, every variety of greed and desperation that probate court could produce. But even she seemed surprised by the crowd packed into her courtroom. The media had followed us inside. Victoria's press conference had turned this into a public spectacle, and now Judge Reynolds had to decide whether to allow cameras or clear the room. "This is a probate hearing, not a circus," she said sternly. "But given the public interest generated by the parties, I'll allow limited media presence. However, any disruption will result in immediate clearing of the gallery." Samuel Winters stood first. "Your Honor, I represent the estate of James Coleman. I have evidence directly relevant to the contestant's claims of ongoing relationship with the deceased." Victoria's attorney, Andrew Blackstone, objected immediately. "Your Honor, any evidence should have been disclosed during discovery." "This evidence was sealed pursuant to specific instructions from the deceased," Samuel replied. "Instructions that it only be opened if the will was contested on grounds of ongoing relationship." Judge Reynolds frowned. "Explain." Samuel approached the bench and handed her a document. "The deceased left explicit instructions that if anyone claimed ongoing relationship as grounds for contesting his will, certain sealed evidence should be presented to the court." The judge read carefully. "This is highly unusual. James Coleman was a highly unusual man, Your Honor. He was extremely thorough in protecting his father's inheritance." "Very well, you may present your evidence, but I warn you this had better be relevant and substantial." Samuel returned to his table and opened his briefcase. "Your Honor, I'd like to present a series of audio recordings made by James Coleman during the final 2 years of his life." Victoria shifted nervously in her seat. Blackstone was whispering urgently in her ear. "The contestant claims that James Coleman called her regularly and maintained emotional intimacy throughout their separation," Samuel continued. "These recordings will demonstrate the true nature of their communications." Samuel connected his laptop to the courtroom's audio system. "The first recording is from March 15, 2022, the same date as the voicemail Mrs. Hartwell played during settlement negotiations." He pressed play. James's voice filled the courtroom, weak but determined. "Recording number 43, March 15th, 10:15 p.m. I just called Victoria. The call went to voicemail. I left a message saying I still loved her and asking her to call back. I was scared about the metastasis news and wanted to hear a familiar voice, any familiar voice. Victoria never called back. She never calls back. But I know she'll save that voicemail. She saves everything that makes her look sympathetic. When I'm gone, she'll use it as proof that we were still close. We weren't close. We haven't been close since she walked out on me in 2009. Every call I make to her goes unanswered. Every text gets ignored unless it's about money or insurance. But I keep calling because sometimes when you're dying, you get desperate enough to call someone who stopped caring years ago." The courtroom was silent. Victoria had gone completely pale. Samuel pressed play on another file. Recording number 87, June 3rd, 2022. James's voice again. "Victoria finally called me back today, after 4 months of ignored messages. You know why she called? Because she heard about the Innovate Dynamics valuation in TechCrunch. Suddenly she's concerned about my health. She asked if I was taking care of myself financially, if I had proper estate planning, if I was thinking about legacy considerations. She didn't ask about my pain levels, didn't ask about treatment response, didn't ask about Dad, who's been sleeping in hospital chairs for 3 months. She asked about money. It's always about money with Victoria." Victoria whispered something to Blackstone, who stood up. "Objection, Your Honor. These recordings are hearsay and prejudicial." "Overruled," Judge Reynolds said firmly. "These are the deceased's own words, recorded contemporaneously." "Continue, Mr. Winters." Samuel played recording after recording. James documenting every phone call, every interaction, every time Victoria reached out, always when money was involved, never when he simply needed support. But the most devastating recording came last. Recording number 238, January 5th, 2024. 3 days before I die. "Dad, if you're hearing this, Victoria came back for the money, didn't she? I knew she would. She's been tracking my company's value for 2 years. Probably has Google alerts set up for my name. There's something you need to know about Victoria. Something I never told you because I was ashamed. She didn't just leave me when I got sick. She tried to convince my doctors to stop treatment." The courtroom erupted. Judge Reynolds banged her gavel for order. James's weak voice continued. "November 2009, 8 months after my diagnosis. I was responding well to treatment, but the medical bills were destroying both our credit. Victoria met with Dr. Morrison privately. She told him that continuing treatment was prolonging my suffering and that palliative care would be more humane.
Dr. Morrison recorded that conversation in my medical file. I didn't know about it until years later when I requested my complete records. Victoria tried to convince my doctor to let me die so she wouldn't have to deal with the financial burden of keeping me alive. When Dr. Morrison refused and said I was a good candidate for continued treatment, Victoria filed for divorce. She didn't leave because she couldn't handle watching me suffer. She left because she couldn't handle paying for treatment that might actually save me. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even the reporters had stopped scribbling.
There's more, Samuel said quietly. He handed Judge Reynolds a thick folder. Dr. Morrison's contemporaneous notes, insurance records showing Victoria's attempts to reduce coverage, bank records showing her transfers of joint funds to personal accounts during James's treatment. He turned to face Victoria directly. And most relevant to today's hearing, recordings of every phone call Mrs. Hartwell made to James in the final 6 months of his life, all 5 of them, each one asking about his will, his estate planning, or his company's valuation, not one asking about his health or his pain or his fears. Victoria stood up abruptly, knocking over her water glass. This is all lies. James was bitter about the divorce. These recordings are fabricated. Are they? Samuel asked. Because we also have the original audio files, with metadata showing exactly when and where they were recorded. Would you like us to authenticate them forensically? Victoria looked around the courtroom wildly, at the reporters, at the cameras, at her lawyer who was frantically shuffling papers and looking like a man who wanted to be anywhere else. I loved James, she said, her voice breaking. I never stopped loving him. But you stopped fighting for him, I said, standing up for the first time. You stopped visiting him. You stopped paying for treatment. You stopped believing he could survive. The doctors said he had a chance, a good chance, but chances cost money and you weren't willing to spend it. Victoria's perfect composure finally shattered completely. Do you have any idea what it was like? Watching someone you love waste away? Watching every dollar disappear into medical bills? Watching your entire future get destroyed by something you can't control? Yes, I said quietly. I do know what that's like, because I did it for 15 years after you left. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the heating system cycling on. The difference is, I continued, I never gave up on him. I never tried to convince doctors to stop treatment. I never asked him to die so my life would be easier. Victoria sank back into her chair, tears streaming down her face. I was 27 years old. I wasn't ready for that kind of responsibility. Then you shouldn't have married him. Judge Reynolds cleared her throat. Mr. Blackstone, does your client wish to continue pursuing her claim? Blackstone looked at Victoria, who was crying too hard to speak. He looked at the folder of evidence Samuel had presented. He looked at the cameras recording his client's complete breakdown. No, Your Honor, he said quietly. We withdraw our contest to the will. So ordered. The original will stands. This hearing is adjourned. As people began filing out of the courtroom, Victoria looked up at me one last time. I'm sorry, she whispered. I know you are, I said. But sorry doesn't bring him back, and it doesn't erase what you did. James had gotten his justice, but the consequences for Victoria were just beginning. By 6 p.m. that evening, Victoria's breakdown was trending on social media. #justice for James, #gold digger exposed, #quiet strength. The courthouse video had been picked up by every major news outlet. CNN, Fox, MSNBC. Local stations from Denver to New York were running the story of the plumber who outsmarted a manipulative ex-wife with her dead husband's own recordings. But the real consequences were just beginning. I was eating dinner in my kitchen when Samuel Winters called. Henry, we need to talk. Can I come over? 20 minutes later, he was sitting at my table with a pot of coffee and a very serious expression. The FBI wants to see those medical records, he said without preamble. The FBI? Victoria's attempt to convince doctors to stop James's treatment could constitute insurance fraud. If she was manipulating medical decisions to reduce financial liability, that's a federal crime. I set down my coffee cup. Are you serious? Completely. And there's more. James's insurance policy had a clause about spousal abandonment during critical illness. If Victoria deliberately interfered with treatment decisions, the insurance company might have grounds to sue her for the full amount they paid out. How much did they pay? $147,000 over 4 years. Samuel pulled out his laptop and showed me a series of emails. These came in over the last 3 hours. The story has gotten attention from some very powerful people. The first email was from Senator Patricia Walsh, chair of the Senate Healthcare Committee. She wanted to use James's case as an example in upcoming hearings about spousal rights during medical crises. The second was from the Denver District Attorney's Office. They were opening an investigation into possible insurance fraud. The third was from Innovate Dynamics Board of Directors. They were calling an emergency meeting to discuss the company's future and wanted me there as the new owner. I don't know anything about running a tech company, I told Samuel. You don't have to run it. James hired excellent people. Your job is just to make sure it continues serving its mission. My phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown number. This is Victoria. Please call me. We need to talk privately. I showed the message to Samuel, who shook his head. Don't call her back. Anything she says now could be used against her in the criminal investigation. Is she really going to be prosecuted? That depends on what the FBI finds. But Henry, there's something else you should know. Samuel pulled up another document on his laptop. James wasn't the only one. I've been contacted by 3 other attorneys representing families in similar situations. Spouses who abandoned terminally ill partners and then came back to claim estates. This happens often? More than you'd think. And James's case is giving other families courage to fight back. We were interrupted by headlights in my driveway. Through the window I saw a white BMW pulling up to my house. She's here, I said. Samuel looked grim. Don't let her in. Don't talk to her. Call me if she tries to contact you again. After Samuel left, I watched Victoria sit in her car for almost an hour. She never got out, never knocked on my door. Just sat there in the dark, probably trying to figure out how her perfect plan had collapsed so completely. When she finally drove away, I called my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, and asked her to keep an eye on the house. Something told me Victoria wasn't done yet. I was right. The next morning, I found a FedEx envelope on my doorstep. Inside was a handwritten letter from Victoria. Henry, it began, I know you have every reason to hate me. I know what I did was wrong, but I need you to understand that I was scared and young, and I made terrible decisions. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for mercy. The FBI contacted me this morning. They're investigating insurance fraud charges. My lawyer says I could face 5 years in federal prison. I know James wanted to protect you, but I don't think he wanted to destroy me completely. Could we find some way to resolve this privately? I'll sign whatever documents you want. I'll admit publicly that I was wrong. I'll pay back the insurance money. Just please don't let them prosecute me. I made mistakes, but I don't deserve to have my life ruined. Please call me. Victoria? I read the letter twice, then called Samuel. She wants to make a deal, I told him. What kind of deal? She'll admit she was wrong publicly, pay back the insurance money, sign whatever documents we want. Samuel was quiet for a moment. Henry, that's not your decision to make anymore. The FBI has opened a criminal investigation. You can't stop that even if you wanted to. Can't I? If I refuse to cooperate? They have James's recordings. They have the medical records. They have the insurance documents. They don't need your cooperation to build a case. That afternoon, Andrew Blackstone called. Mr. Coleman, I'm calling on behalf of Victoria Hartwell. She'd like to meet with you to discuss a resolution. There's nothing to resolve, I said. The will stands. The FBI is handling the criminal investigation. What else is there? She's prepared to make a substantial donation to a charity of your choice, as a gesture of goodwill. How substantial? $2 million, I almost laughed. She's trying to buy her way out of federal prison? She's trying to make amends for the pain she caused. The time for amends was 15 years ago, Mr. Blackstone, when my son needed her, and she chose money over marriage. Mr. Coleman, the answer is no. Victoria made her choices. Now she gets to live with the consequences. I hung up and never heard from Andrew Blackstone again. 3 days later, Victoria Hartwell was arrested at Denver International Airport. She'd been trying to board a flight to Costa Rica with a one-way ticket and $40,000 in cash. The federal judge denied bail. Justice, it turned out, was more thorough than revenge, and more satisfying. 6 weeks later, the ripple effects were still spreading. Victoria's wellness blog, which had boasted 200,000 followers, was shut down after sponsors pulled their support. Screenshots of her courthouse breakdown had become memes. Living my best life became internet shorthand for someone whose greed backfired spectacularly. Her influencer friends abandoned her one by one. The wellness industry, built on authenticity and positive energy, had no place for someone who'd tried to convince doctors to let her husband die. But the consequences went deeper than social media shame. The insurance company, Mutual Health Partners, filed a civil lawsuit demanding full restitution of the $147,000 they'd paid for James's treatment. Their legal team argued that Victoria's interference with medical decisions constituted fraudulent manipulation of coverage. The FBI investigation expanded beyond Victoria's case. Special Agent Sarah Mitchell, who was leading the inquiry, called me personally to explain what they'd discovered. "Your son's recordings opened up a much larger investigation," she said. "We've identified at least 12 similar cases across 4 states. Spouses abandoning terminally ill partners and then manipulating estate proceedings. 12 cases? Probably more. Your story gave other families courage to come forward. We're calling it the Coleman effect." Senator Patricia Walsh's Healthcare Committee announced hearings on spousal abandonment during medical crises. James's case was featured prominently in her opening statement. "The Coleman family's tragedy illustrates a critical gap in our legal protections," Senator Walsh declared. "When someone vows in sickness and in health, that commitment should have legal meaning." 3 states introduced Coleman laws, requiring mandatory waiting periods before spouses could contest medical treatment decisions. The legislation was nicknamed James's Law by advocates, but the most satisfying consequence was what happened to Innovate Dynamics. I attended my first board meeting wearing the same khakis and sport coat I'd worn to court. The boardroom was intimidating: glass walls, leather chairs, a conference table that probably cost more than my truck. "Mr. Coleman," the board chair, Elizabeth Morgan, began carefully, "we want to assure you that we're committed to continuing James's vision for the company." What was his vision? Ethical technology, data security that protects privacy instead of exploiting it, sustainable business practices that prioritize employees over quarterly profits. "And you think I can help with that?" Elizabeth smiled. "James talked about you constantly. He said you taught him that fixing things properly takes time, patience, and attention to detail. Those aren't bad qualities for a company owner. Over the following weeks, I learned that James had built something remarkable. Innovate Dynamics wasn't just profitable. It was principled. Employee turnover was virtually 0. Customer satisfaction was above 90%. The company had never had a data breach or privacy violation. I didn't try to run the company. I hired Elizabeth Morgan as CEO and gave her complete operational control. My job was simpler: make sure the company stayed true to James's values. The first decision I made was establishing the James Coleman Foundation. Half the company's annual profits would go to helping families facing medical bankruptcy. The foundation's first grant went to the Patterson family in Colorado Springs. Their 8-year-old daughter had leukemia, and they were facing the same financial devastation James and I had experienced. "We can't save families from medical bills," I told the foundation's board, "but we can make sure they don't have to choose between treatment and financial survival." Victoria's criminal trial was scheduled for September. Her new attorney, a public defender named Martinez, had approached Samuel about a plea bargain. 5 years in federal prison, Samuel told me. She'll serve at least 3. "What do you think James would want?" Samuel considered the question carefully. "I think James wanted the truth to come out. He wanted people to understand what really happened. Mission accomplished." "And Victoria?" "I think James understood that actions have consequences. Some consequences can't be negotiated away with money or lawyers or charm." Victoria Hartwell had spent years believing that wealth and manipulation could solve any problem. She was about to discover she was wrong. In September, she would learn that some problems can only be solved by accepting responsibility, and some consequences are non-negotiable. September 23, 2024, 9 months after James died. Victoria pled guilty to insurance fraud and obstruction of medical care. The judge sentenced her to 4 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. I wasn't there for the sentencing. I was in Houston visiting the family of Maria Santos, a single mother whose husband had cancer. The James Coleman Foundation was paying for his experimental treatment. When Samuel called with the news, I was sitting in a hospital waiting room that looked exactly like the ones where I'd spent 4 years watching James fight for his life. "It's over," Samuel said simply. "Good. How do you feel?" I thought about it. Relieved, not happy, not vindicated, just relieved. James would be proud of you. James would be proud of what we built, the foundation, the legislation, the other families we've helped. 12 families so far, Samuel said, with more applications coming in every week. After I hung up, I walked outside the hospital and called my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson. "How are things at the house?" "Quiet," she said. "No more reporters, no more lawyers, just normal neighborhood quiet." "Good. I'll be home tomorrow." That evening, I had dinner with Maria Santos while her husband slept in his hospital room. She was exhausted, scared, overwhelmed by medical decisions and insurance forms and the constant uncertainty of treatment. "How do you keep going?" she asked me. "One day at a time, one decision at a time, one bill at a time." "Were you ever angry at the people who should have helped but didn't?" I thought about Victoria, sitting in a federal prison cell, probably still wondering how her perfect plan had fallen apart. "Anger is like a leak in your plumbing," I told her. "If you don't fix it at the source, it just keeps causing damage." What was the source? People who think love is conditional, who think family is negotiable, who think you can walk away from responsibility and come back when it's convenient. And the fix? Setting boundaries, protecting what matters, making sure the people who stay are the ones who deserve to stay. James taught me that family isn't about blood or marriage certificates or legal documents. Family is about who shows up when showing up is hard, who stays when staying hurts, who fights for you when you can't fight for yourself. I learned that some fights are worth having. Some boundaries are worth defending. Some consequences are worth accepting. Most importantly, I learned that quiet strength isn't about staying silent. It's about speaking truth when truth matters most. If you're watching this, thank you for listening to James's story. Please subscribe and let me know where you're watching from, because everyone deserves to know what real family looks like.